Wonderful. So thank you all for being here in whichever way you're being here. I apologize if I get distracted because I feel like I'm at Command Central here. There's like 17 screens that we're all maneuvering. But I also want to thank Rachel Lefkowitz, who's one of the people named Addith Israel, for helping as well with the tech. So here's what we're going to talk about. What we haven't had an opportunity, we've had, over the last many months, we've had some really impactful and meaningful witness testimony on what's been going on in Israel. We've had some people who are sharing perspectives close to the lines of what's happening, farther, the sort of secondary and tertiary ripples of what has been going on. But what we're going to do today is we're going to ask ourselves, especially in the wake of what happened at Beth Hillel this week, especially in the conversation and the wake of what, how we are responding to just the horrors of war and seeing it too close because of social media and because of the way the world responds. We're going to take what I would call not the news, but the news analysis, right? We're going to try to figure out, take a step back and kind of see, okay, how in a Jewish and ethical lens can we make sense of some of the critiques that are going on, some of the challenges that are going on, some of the realities that are going on, and also what does this mean for our identities as Jews? So I'm going to start with about 3 minutes of sort of facts on the ground, because I know that there are people who are already like stressed and their blood pressures are rising and everything like that, and they're going to say, but is he going to defend Israel? Is he going to critique Israel? What's he going to do? What's he going to do? What's he going to do? Okay, so
What you gonna do?
I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a couple of facts. These are not facts that get a lot of response, because nowadays news gets response because of emotion. News is 90% kishkas and 10% fact, right? Okay, and so I'm going to give you some of the facts, and then I'm going to start and end by saying that war is heartbreaking. Full stop. That's it. What happens in war, whether we knew it because we're seeing it, or whether it was sort of something that was happening out there in World War II, or the Vietnam War, or something that felt far away. War is heartbreaking. Sometimes, according to Jewish teaching, war is necessary. If you believe that you are correct, if you believe that there are sides that are moral and sides that are immoral, and sides that try to be moral in a world and in efforts that are inherently challenging to morals, sometimes the history of the world is such, it has never not been that people who are immoral try to take advantage of people at their moments of weakness or at their moments of distraction. That is the history of the world. It is also the history of the world that there has never been, in the last 5,000 to 7,000 years, a time when an army walked into a place and said, I declare this land in the name of the Queen of Spain, and someone else was not already there, speaking a different language and saying, who the hell is this guy to declare this land in the name of someone else? That is the reality of the world. We don't have to like it. It is fact. Here are some other facts. The civilian to militant death ratio, some of you heard me say this, for the current war has gone below the 1.8 to 1 ratio that it had been before. It's currently about 1.6 to 1. That is with and despite the fact that those civilians are actually militants because they're housing weapons and hostages. which makes them not civilians, but let's even say that they are civilians. It is also despite the fact that Hamas uses them as human shields, which is a war crime, which of course means that they are, yes, victims, and they are they're victims of Hamas, right? Which is heartbreaking. Yesterday we got word of another thing that was heartbreaking, which is the aid workers.
Yeah.
This happens in every war. It is no more or less heartbreaking than in any other war where this happens. War is heartbreaking. That is the point of this. To put the 1.8 to 1 ratio in perspective, the last 30 years of US and or NATO wars have had an average militant to civilian ratio where it was civilian to militant, meaning like more civilians than militants. It's always more civilians than militants in urban places, unless you're on a remote battlefield, of 4.5 to 1. Meaning when the United States defends itself against 9/11, or goes into Serbia, Croatia, or into Somalia, or anywhere else, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or any of the other places that it does, Israel is being 3 times more, almost 3 times more cautious than the United States. Last piece of fact on this. The pro-Palestinian say, UNRWA and others say that the civilian to militant ratio in Gaza is 50 to 1. Again, how you define a civilian, how you define a militant is very hairy, but let's take their number for a second. If it were indiscriminate bombing, you would expect a death rate of 50 to 1, which means that Israel is being over 25 times more cautious than what would be called indiscriminate bombing. And with all of that said, in the last 4 minutes, war is heartbreaking. It is awful. It is terrible. It is not good. And no one, especially Israel, wanted this war. And certainly no one wants the threat of another imminent planned war, which is what Hamas is saying, right? Like, if we stop this one, we're just going to start the next one, right? They've said that every day since October 7th. So I'm laying all of that out there because what we're going to struggle with, and what I think that certainly the non-Jewish world struggles with, but I'm going to accuse the Jewish world to struggle with it arguably even more, is that we are not comfortable being that person that wages war. Historically, we have not been powerful enough to be the people who wages war. And so the issue that we're going to deal with today, the ethical issue, is what does it mean to have power? And yes, in the Spider-Man way of with power comes responsibility, but more, what does it mean Jewishly to have defined ourselves for, I would argue, 2,200 years since the Maccabees, as a non-powerful entity? This is even before the exile. To have developed an identity as a non-powerful entity, and now to be in the 76th year of having power. And I would argue even that is an overstatement, because really, I would argue we're in the 57th year of having power. No one really believed in Jewish power from 1967. Everyone kind of said, well, they're just going to die eventually anyway. It's nice while it lasted. We didn't become a real thing that was going to stick around until after the 6-Day War. So we have a half century of experience in the last 2,200 years of having power. That's not a lot. And I don't think, I mean, I'm really struggling with this, and you may hear more about this on the high holidays, though not with as many texts and not with as many details, so you guys get the, under the hood, behind the scenes, behind the music view of this. But I don't think we figured it out. I know that the world has not figured it out. I don't think we have figured it out. And I can't change the world, but we can at least look at ourselves and say, what does it mean to have power? What does it mean to say and have the ability to enforce never again? Right? Never again from 1945 to 1967. First of all, it wasn't really a phrase, you should know. The origins of it, I'll tell you in a second. But it wasn't really a phrase for the first half generation after the Holocaust. But never again was something that we said as a prayer, not as a mandate or a battle cry. It was originally listed as a battle cry by someone who most of us, I'm going to guess, don't really like. He was excommunicated in a number of Jewish communities. He was eventually assassinated, I believe, in 1990. Never again was originally popularized by Meir Kahane of the Jewish Defense League. How does that make you feel? That, you know, we put it on like Yom HaShoah things with a candle, and it feels so spiritual and whatever. But what he meant was never again, and if someone threatens you, shoot them. This is the guy who said every Jew with a 22. He was in 1990 on the wrong side of that. He was killed. So we haven't figured out what it means to have Jewish power. We haven't figured it out. And this is, I intend for this to make you squirm. Because if we don't squirm with this one and struggle with this one, we're not going to figure it out. We're just going to go through these waves of, how could they do this to us? I thought we were after such a terrible history. Didn't anyone learn the lessons of the Holocaust? Okay, now let's have Israel kick the crap out of them. Oh, wait, we don't want to have Israel kick the crap out of them that much. We want just a little bit of crap kicked out of them, and then we'll just do it again, and there'll be another October 7th, which is the cycle that we have been on for any time in the last half century. If we kick a little bit of crap out of them, we won't feel like we're morally overstepping, and we can still hold on to the claim to victimhood the next time we get nailed. That's a terrible way to live, but that's what we set up for ourselves. I'm not talking about what the world thinks. The world doesn't want us to be powerful at all. That's for sure. We're going to look at that too. So that's what we got today. If you're uncomfortable, buckle your seatbelts because you ain't seen nothing yet, okay? We're hitting this head on today, folks. So here we go. Here, Kathy, I'll give you one here, and then we can pass. And I'm going to screen share for the people on Zoom. I think Len has them for the people in Philadelphia. Let's see how many ways we can show this source sheet. Okay, here we go. Reminder to the people on Zoom, if you want to say something, don't be shy. Unmute yourself. But I can't see you once I screen share, so it's been nice knowing you. So here, I'm going to take you through the first couple of texts very quickly. The first two especially, and then the last two on the first page especially. We're going to go through these texts with blinding speed, because I think you know them or you know of them, even if you don't know them specifically. You may be shocked to see how similar they are one to another. And then we're going to draw what we call the nimshal, or in modern Hebrew, the azma. So now what does this all mean, kind of thing, right? Azma means so what? Right? You got to say it like that. You can't, you know. All right. So you know these texts, or you've heard of these texts, right? The first text is how we ended up being a persecuted people outside of our homeland in Egypt. You know, Joseph, famine, 7 years. Joseph saves Egypt. Egypt becomes a superpower because Egypt has all the food and no one else does in the whole region. Everyone comes to Egypt. They sell their property and everything of their claims. They basically sell themselves into servitude no matter where they're living, anywhere from Syria to Libya. And Egypt becomes the superpower of the moment, and that's all thanks to Joseph. Joseph brings his people, who become a protected people within the borders of Israel. They leave, and they say, why we don't have to export and import this thing? You know, just come live in my neighborhood, and I'll make sure you're fine, right? You should live closer to me, right? As we say to our elderly parents, right? Okay, right? Okay. So, all right. And so here they are, but then there's a new king. When it says doesn't know Joseph, probably didn't give a crap about Joseph. He probably did know Joseph. I'm using that phrase a lot today, but we're going to use that phrase a lot today. Okay, and he sees this foreign people that didn't have to sell them into servitude, that were protected by a prior government, that seem to be foreign in 100 different ways, and that have a high birth rate. By the way, that's not our problem right now in America, but let's okay.
Our neighbors are trying though.
What?
Our neighbors are trying.
Our neighbors are trying. Our neighbors are trying. Sure. God bless. Okay. So and so what does he say? He says, you know what? We shouldn't have this people who are a foreign people. We should deal shrewdly with them. Hava nit chachma, right? Okay. And we should do things so that they don't increase. And the way he says I have a great idea how to make sure that there aren't more babies that are Jewish babies. Let's kill the ones that we got. So, and that's the story. We're about to celebrate this or commemorate this in 3 weeks. Start bleeding. So, okay. And so that's how we become. We are seen as other or different within a host nation, and we are seen as successful, and we are therefore persecuted. It should sound very similar to what we said 2 weeks ago with Haman. Boo. Right, okay? That guy says, Yeshno amachad mefuzar mefarad. There's this people, they're scattered throughout the Persian Empire. They are different. They're Persian, but they're not so Persian. They don't feel like maybe they have dual loyalties. I'm not so sure what's going on here. They don't follow all our laws because they have these weird laws. They won't eat things, I don't know. Anyway, let's destroy them. Right? Okay? The story is almost identical, right? I mean, the details aren't, but you get the idea. The story is identical. There's this group, they're living as vassals or citizens, loyal. And by the way, Mordechai, someone once tried to make the claim to me in a high holiday conversation in the sanctuary that if only we would have been loyal subjects in Persia and not been so uppity as to want to be powerful, that we could have kept our heads down and there wouldn't have been Purim, like we wouldn't have been plotted for destruction, and we should have just been loyal royals or royal loyals.
And what would have been the?
Well, it's also what I didn't have the presence of mind to say at that moment when that was said to me was, Mordechai was a royal.
Right.
He saved the king from an assassination plot. Right? We know that Jews have historically been the best citizens of our host nations, the most loyal, willing to assimilate to ways that have probably hurt us more than helped us, right? And there's no level of assimilation that makes this, that sort of diffuses the venom of anti-Semitism, right? You can't get un-Jewish enough, right? Because if they're looking for a difference, they're going to find it, right? Assimilation is not a fix for anti-Semitism. If anything, it's the opposite because it makes us less vigilant, right?
Okay. The Nazis 1/8 Jewish?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
It was a grandparent. It was a grandparent, I believe.
Oh, I thought it was
So,
1/8, yeah.
I mean, because that's what he was using the law of return, right? Okay. And by the way, we know this from Kathy just said, what about the Nazis? We know this because there were tons of assimilated Jews who held up they didn't call it World War I because there hadn't been a World War II yet. They held up their Great War medals at the deportation stations and said, I am German, I am not so Jewish. And guess where they ended up? In the same cattle cars. Same cattle cars. Right? Okay. So, all right. So here's what we've got this model that has been set up, which this is, Vihisha Amda, which is the third text that you have here. I'm going to scroll down for the people on the Zoom. Vihisha Amda, this is the closest thing in the Pesach Seder to the formula for all Jewish holidays, which is they tried to kill us, they didn't, let's eat, right? So this happens before we eat in the Pesach Seder, right? And it says the following, it's happened to our ancestors, happens to us. It didn't happen just once that someone tries to destroy us. Every generation someone tries to destroy us, and we just make it out by the skin of our teeth. Yay us. Eat a little charoset, shalom. And I'm struggling with this line this year. This is the line I'm struggling with. I don't want to just barely survive. I don't want to just barely make it through with what's been called Sherit Ha'am. By the way, many of you may know of like a synagogue called Sherith Israel or Sherit Israel or all of those things. You know what those synagogues? You know what they're holding up? They're celebrating. Just barely. Sherit means the remnant, we are the people who didn't die. Well, can you imagine?
That's depressing.
I'm a proud member of the synagogue of people who just got out in time. I mean, give me like a Beth Shalom or something like that. It's a better name, right? Right? But that we hold that up as a point of pride. I don't feel like I want to hold that up as a point of pride anymore. I feel like if something has changed with Jewish power, it's that we shouldn't do this. And by the way, Israelis really don't like this idea. The reason that Yom HaShoah is not on the internationally UN Day for Holocaust commemoration Day is in January 27th. That's the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, when other nations saved us. Israel, the Knesset said, no, we're not going to do that. And they hold it in Israel. Yom HaShoah, we observe it also here at Yom HaShoah, is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where we said, even if we're going to die doing it, we're not going to give up on Jewish power. And because Israelis couldn't imagine the sheep to the slaughter model. It was anathema. So the question is, so that's what we say about what others say about us. You got that? That's our Bible, our Haggadah, saying what others intended to do for us. Now let's hear it from the others themselves. Because this ethos of weak Jews being persecuted by stronger ruling nations, of which we are resident aliens, right? That's essentially the model. This is embedded in Christian and Muslim theology almost from the beginning. All right? So Augustine, right? Augustine was a 4th century Christian theologian. Augustine is a very controversial thinker. Brilliant. He is one of these people who when you're looking at it, as we Jews do, which is like, okay, fine, we can learn church history, but what did it mean for the Jews, right? Was it good for the Jews? Relative to his contemporaries, Augustine wasn't so bad for us. Because Augustine lived approximately the same time as, for example, John Chrysostom, who wanted to kill us. And he wrote these tractates called Adversos Judaeos, which means exactly what it sounds like in the Latin, which is against the Jews. And they were terrible. They were biting, and basically it was because you didn't accept Jesus, so therefore you should be annihilated and all sorts of other terrible things. And Augustine said, don't kill the Jews. So at first you're like, all right, I like this guy, right? Don't kill the Jews. And remember, this is the 4th century, so this is like the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. This is when Constantine in the East is his mother, Helena goes and she has this vision in Jerusalem. She tours Jerusalem and she says, this is where Jesus was crucified. And because she was the mother of an emperor, that's where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre this is where Jesus was buried. That's where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built. Even though we know that was not the case, but it's okay. It doesn't have to be the case. It's fine. We all have stories. Okay. So anyway, so Christianity was very powerful at this time in the 4th century, and rising. Judaism was decidedly not. Augustine says, don't kill the Jews. So the Jews, of course, are thinking, I'm with Augustine. Right? We should have read the fine print. Why don't kill the Jews? Don't kill the Jews because we Christians need a living witness to the consequences for not accepting the new covenant, aka the New Testament, aka Jesus, as the Son of God. And so we need Jews to be downtrodden as a living witness to what happens when you reject Christ. That's what Augustine was saying. He does it in terms of the mark of Cain, which is, of course, you should know early Christians didn't realize that Jesus had gotten everything from the Old Testament, or what we call the Bible, right? Augustine actually was very much about reading the Hebrew Bible as a witness for what happens if you don't accept it. Act 2, right? And so he uses the image of the mark of Cain to remind you the mark of Cain is what happens. Cain and Abel, right? Cain kills Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? The answer to that question, without it being answered in the Bible, never answered in the Bible. Am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. Okay. But Cain is punished. He is not killed, even though he commits a capital crime. His punishment is to wander the earth with this mark, and Augustine says Cain was not punished with bodily death. So to the preservation of the Jews will be proof to believing Christians of the merited subjection of the Jews. That's a nice way of saying keep them down, but keep them alive. Okay? Now, relative to John Chrysostom, that was better for us, because otherwise we were dead. He was actually saying to Chrysostom, don't kill them, right? The modern day equivalent of this, and it's more complicated than this, are the people who take issue with the Christian Zionists, right? Who, and some of them are like, not all Christian Zionists are the same, but some of the Christian Zionists are like, we got to keep the Jews in Israel because that's a sign, it's one of the precursors of the second coming, right? My feeling of that is, because I don't live under the thumb, because Israel is a sovereign nation, and I don't live under the thumb of the Christian Zionists, is, look, we don't got so many friends, and if in the I don't believe what they are believing, but if I'm wrong, it'll be too late anyway, right? So we need some friends, but it doesn't feel great, right? So that's Augustine. That's early. Augustine, by the way, wins the debate, and there we go. That's the Christian sort of foundation for the downtrodden, is that Jews shouldn't be so powerful or so successful or so prominent or preeminent. It goes back to the 4th century. And by the way, 4th century sounds like far into Christianity. You should know it's not, right? Because in the 3rd century, that's when Christianity actually became a religion. In the 2nd century, all Christianity was a bunch of people who thought that they were Jewish, but were ticked off that all the other Jews thought that they were wrong. They were called proto-Christians.
But didn't the Crusades kill the Jews?
Way later.
Way later.
Between 1000 and
Right.
late 1300s, yes.
Yeah,
So yeah, that was way
They
later.
were not following.
No. We were equally dispensable, but some of us had to live at least, not all of us. Some of
Okay.
us. Remember Shairit, right? The remnant. Okay. It's also in Islam. It is embedded from the earliest parts of Islam too, within 100 years of Muhammad. There is in Sharia, in Muslim law, a concept known as the dhimmi. Okay, D-H, you say th, right? The dhimmi, which literally in Arabic means the protected class. The Muslim conquest, which is, so basically within a century after the life of Muhammad, the goal of Islam was to conquer the world, right? They got as far as southern Spain. They didn't kill the Jews because the Jews were known as al-Akitab, which means the people of the book. Meaning you could be a protected class because we have some scripture in similarity one to another, and some prophets in similarity one to another. you could be a protected class so far as, and I pulled this from the 9th century, it actually predates the 9th century in other areas, but it's, the Pact of Umar was where it was like, I mean, it's the most quotable one, right? Okay, it's hard to find this stuff in translation, but basically, the Pact of Umar says, you can see it on the bottom of that first page, we're not going to build any new houses of worship. If we're here, but we can't build any more. They can't be any taller than the shortest minaret in town, right? We've got to pay a poll tax,
I
right?
just told them my home.
Known as the jizya. Known as the jizya, and we have to pay that every year. It's kind of like a per person. Well, I guess that's what a poll tax is. And we have to. Okay, there we go. We have to do that, indefinitely. Otherwise, we lose our dhimmi status. We lose our protected status, and then we get conquered like anyone else, right? Okay. Eventually, this was extended also to other religions. I think Zoroastrians got the dhimmi protection, and other things that don't share scripture. I'm not an expert in Quranic law, so don't quote me on this, but this part I know.
But it says we made a condition on ourselves. So who imposed that on us?
It's like when God says, you can choose whether or not to get the Torah. I'm going to hold Mount Sinai over your head. It's totally your choice. But if you say no, I'm going to drop the mountain.
Okay.
Right? When Umar came in, he's like, the Jews are, he's like, you got a choice. It's not on me. It's not on me. You have a choice. You can accept these terms and be protected under the Muslim conquest, or we can
Conquer you.
we can liberate your head from the rest of your body. That's the most liberation you're going to get, right? Okay, that's all the liberation.
Shower, causing extensive damage with buildings teetering on the edge.
Okay, so the reason I bring you these texts is not because every Christian believes them. In fact, most Christians don't. Not because every Muslim believes them. In fact, many Muslims don't. I don't actually know where that falls, but obviously the Muslim conquest stopped at some point in time, right? Muslims do not rule the world. That was the original plan, but they're currently not in that mode, right? Okay? I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that the idea, certainly by the 4th century for Christianity and the 9th century for Islam, the idea of Jewish power was unacceptable theologically for all the places, or most of the places, where Jews lived. Right? And that hasn't changed. What hasn't changed as well is the fact that we have internalized that. We accepted it. Marcia, you saw, we accepted it. And originally we accepted it under duress. By the way, we also accepted it under duress under Christianity. I mean, the Inquisition is the classic example of that, right? We accepted it, and then along the way, we didn't just accept it as like a necessary vicious evil, we accepted it as our identity. And then we rallied to it. And by the way, this is all, you can go into collective psychology about this, right? When people are persecuted, at first they say this is unfair, then it becomes sort of the status quo that is unquestioned, and then if they really want to have a sense of dignity, the only thing they can do is they can rally behind it, which is the origins of they tried to kill us, they didn't.
Like the Stockholm syndrome kind of thing?
It is a little bit, but Stockholm syndrome tends to be one person, right? This is a collective Stockholm syndrome. Look at me barely surviving. I got so much, I'm so downtrodden, but damn it, I'm here. Right? And honestly, that has been the Jewish story for the overwhelming better part of Jewish history. It changed after the Holocaust. It actually changed before the Holocaust, right? So I'm going to take you now. We're on page 2, and I'm going to go through this really fast.
1896, the first Congress.
Yeah, we're getting to Herzl. Herzl's going to be page 3. I'm going to take you through page 2 just because we're not going to have a lot of time. I'm going to take you through page 2 really quickly. So when I keep saying the last 2,200 years, the thing before the last 2,200 years that makes it not longer than 2,200 years were the Maccabees, right? We know the story of the Maccabees. A lot of assimilation. Maccabees said don't assimilate. Jews said whatever. So much assimilation that they put up an idol of Zeus in the temple courtyard. Then the rest of the Jews said, well, maybe those Maccabees have something to say about this. They're not so wrong. We'll join their war effort. They become the Zealots. They take back Jerusalem. They have a slightly under 100-year reign in Judea. From about 163 BCE until Herod, which was middle 1st century BC, 60, I think it was 63 actually, but when Herod comes to power. Herod officially ends the Maccabean Hasmonean reign. Hasmonean and Maccabean are the same thing, right? You would think the rabbis would be so proud of this time. They just got off of the temple being destroyed, by the Romans. Oh, do you remember those days when we were our own rulers? Now we're exiled. I'm living in this dump called Yavne, or maybe Tiberias, which was slightly better, but not much, right? Do you remember when we were in charge of our own destiny? You would think that. The rabbis hated the Maccabees. Hated the Maccabees. Maccabees did a good thing. They got back the temple, they purified their worship, we were able a couple more centuries to do it. The Maccabees were awful leaders. Jewish power did not come naturally to them. They sold the high priesthood for a bribe. They destroyed everyone and everything in their path. In fact, if you've ever gone to Israel and done dig for a day in those caves underneath, where you sift through and everything like that, those caves originally belonged to a nation called the Nabateans. The Nabateans were people who lived under the Maccabees. They were a pagan tribe, and they were given a choice, a very Maccabean choice that should sound very similar to the choices that people gave the Jews. You could leave, because Judea is going to be for the Jews. You could be circumcised and join the Jews, or you could die. They left. Given the choice between circumcision and death,
Leaving was easier.
yes. And so the Maccabees were really corrupt, really hard leaders. They were not good at having power. They weren't. They simply were not good at having power, and they were corrupt, and they were short-lived. And
Hoodlums.
yeah, they were more organized than hoodlums, but yes, they were extreme. They were zealots. They were extremists, right? Okay. But what do we say when we talk in liturgy? This is the middle of the text, the middle of the page, or it's the bottom of the page for those who are on Zoom, the screen share. We don't talk about the years after the Maccabees. We talk about the war and winning the war, and we talk about the oil too, which the only part the rabbis want to talk about, right? So if you look at the text that you have in front of us, what Atar Hadari, who's a scholar, says it wasn't the victorious war for freedom and sovereignty that the rabbis objected to. That's the story of Hanukkah, but how the warriors waged the peace. That's the challenge. Now, modern Israel has not even had a peace, right, to wage, but that's another issue. What do we talk about? We talk about how God gave the mighty into the hands of the weak, meaning, it's the same thing. We barely lived, right? The Darrahorn I'm not going to spend a lot of time on right now, but the Darrahorn is a recent book. It's about 2 years old now, 2.5 years old, where she basically makes the case that I'm making right now, which is that the world is not okay, and we even are not okay with strong Jews, with powerful Jews. It's a great book. It's a really important book. It's a really important book. But basically, I gave you some quotes here. She gives a couple of things about why Jews standing out and being uncool was actually the source of our power. But also the reason why people threaten is because we do stand out whether we like it or not. And no amount of assimilation is going to make us stand out little enough. And she talks about Anne Frank in sort of really hard ways, right? She says, the entire appeal of Anne Frank to the wild world, as opposed to those who knew and loved her, lay in her lack of a future. The fact that Anne Frank died is what makes her interesting to people. It's like Titanic,
Right.
right? It's not an interesting cross-Atlantic voyage until the boat sinks, right?
No one would know about it.
It would just be an interesting little diary.
Was it in her book that it said they liked us for the first few days, or was she after the war?
Dara Horn's version.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they liked us when we're victims, when we become strong.
Well, they brought it back
Like, right, in October.
October 7th, yes.
Right.
Okay, so readers of her diary are aware that the author was murdered in genocide, but that does not mean that her diary is a work about genocide. If it were, it would be unlikely, would have been anywhere near as universally embraced as that she is good with and despite her death, right? And so Dara Horn is infuriated by this, but that's what she does. So, 1896, what happens? Now we're going to go to
First Zionist country.
First Zionist country. This is Herzl's. This is an excerpt from Herzl's pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, right? So back in the Emancipation times in the late 19th century, if you had an idea, you wrote a pamphlet. Now you just tweet it, right? Okay. But that's what this was, right? But I'm going to take you through excerpts from Der Judenstaat because I think that Herzl, and this is the last text I got for you, mostly, I think that Herzl is the one who first understands Jewish power as a necessity in modern times. So the story of Herzl is that he's a journalist, he's totally assimilated Jew, barely sees himself as Jewish, from Vienna, but he's covering the Dreyfus Affair, which was a Jewish French officer, clearly anti-Semitic, J'accuse, right? The whole thing of why is this guy getting decommissioned, right? You know, the epaulets, you know, the sword on his knee, the whole thing, right? Okay? Publicly humiliated, and it's clearly anti-Semitism, and Herzl comes to the conclusion that if it wasn't going to work in France, which was the sort of the seat of Jewish emancipation, right? Napoleon was talking about Jews being citizens 100 years before that, almost, right? 80 some years before that. And if it wasn't going to happen in France, it wasn't going to happen anywhere. And so Herzl comes up with this idea that we need to be the authors of our own destiny. That we can never be fully assured. It'll be good for a little bit, it'll be not good for a little bit, like the cycle, right? Until we build our own state. And so he writes a pamphlet.
That's power, though.
Right, that is power. And he says, we need it, right? Because no matter how powerful we may be under another ruler, we'll never be more than Joseph was number 2 to the Pharaoh. We're never going to be Pharaoh. It's interesting, by the way, we had this conversation. He died last week, Joe Lieberman. This was a real conversation that Jews had. Like, is it so good for the Jews that we have a vice president who might be Jewish? Might have a vice president. Do you remember that conversation? We weren't so sure that we liked that idea. It was an issue. We weren't. I'm not talking about the rest of the country. The rest of the country voted. I'm not saying they voted only because he was Jewish, but I think some did. Okay. Anyway, these are excerpts from Der Judenstaat. The only reason I'm doing the reading here is because it's hard with all the different people. Okay, all the different places. Okay, and I'm going to do it as fast as I can. Okay, when he says the situation of the Jews, he's talking about anti-Semitism. He's talking about persecution. He's talking about any of the things, bias, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And all the bold is mine. It's not in his original, right? Okay. Wherever people know that there are Jews, there's anti-Semitism, right? By the way, that's like, you know, we used to think, and I think this week belied this, right? We used to think, you know,
Somewhere else.
where there are no Jews, then they think that we have horns and you know, like that's where the anti-Semitism is, right? Except the anti-Semitism is in the middle of the shtetl right here at Beth Hillel, right? Okay, so and what happens? Don't buy from the Jews. By the way, that's BDS. That's straight up BDS right there. But remember, this is 125 years ago. This is 130 years ago that he's talking, right? Okay, attacks. I mean, you have to read this and you have to think like you could almost hear this tweeted now. Attacks in parliaments and assemblies, in the press, in the pulpit, in the street, on journeys, their exclusion from certain hotels, places of recreation become daily more numerous, right? In the principal countries where anti-Semitism prevails, it does so as a result of the emancipation of the Jews. The more assimilated and integrated we are, the more anti-Semitism there is he's arguing. Right? By the way, I'm not so sure I necessarily didn't agree with that. Like it also happened in Anatevka, right? Or whatever, the shtetl, right? It happened in Kishinev, right? So I'm not so sure I fully agree with that, but okay, fine, right? He's talking to the emancipated Jews. He's talking about Vienna. He's talking about Paris.
Which is where he was.
Yeah,
I mean,
this was his life. He wasn't speaking to the shtetl Jew.
these men, because they were all men, came to the Congress in black tie and top hat.
Yeah. This was no Stribes.
This was not, Tevye was not coming with the milk cans.
No, not
Right.
at all, right? This is not, they didn't come from the shtetl.
Right,
Later on, by the way, the Jewish yishuv and
Right, it was-
did try to incorporate the ultra-Orthodox, right? Okay? And so he says, the whole plan, he says, I got a plan, it's so simple, let sovereign be granted. Right? Look at my italicized note here. I think it's an important note, right? So he says this all happened because of emancipation, right? And so he does not say though, let's re-shtetlize, right? Let's de-emancipate. It's not even a word, right? He says, you want emancipation? I'll show you emancipation. I don't want Joseph as number 2 to Pharaoh. I want a place where we are it, right? He pushes farther. He goes right into the skid, hard, right? This was the new piece, because for 60 so years before that, emancipation was all about almost 100 years actually with Napoleon, can we be sufficiently French so that our Judaism is incidental, but we can live in France? By the way, I could have said that same sentence in America, and it's the thing that we are figuring out now. How American and how Jewish are we going to be? And how much is that going to be an internal conversation about assimilation, and how much of that is going to be an extrinsically ensured reality because of anti-Semitism?
That isn't something we're just saying now.
No, we've been saying for
My whole life that has been.
that has always been an issue. Certainly post-Holocaust, it's been an issue. I think I could argue that it's been an issue. It was an issue for the Jews of Spain. It was an issue for the Jews of Germany. I would argue it was an issue for the Jews of Persia with Mordechai and King Ahasuerus. This is the issue. Emancipation, power. How good is it? How not good is it? And once we get it, what do we do with it? Because Herzl takes emancipation and he redefines it, not as how French, American, Spanish, Persian, German can we be and be happy within an exilic Jewish community that has thrived for, in Poland, it was 1,000 years. And he says that's not good enough because every one of those examples has an end date, has an expiration date. Every single one of them, and any place that we live, it is a historical reality, and it's why 1,000 people showed up at Beth Hillel last Monday, right? 2 nights ago, because we are terrified that this was and I'm not being like calamitous here or
Alarmist.
alarmist. I'm not catastrophizing, right? But there's a part of us that worries if that was the canary, if that was the sign, if we're going to look backwards and say,
1938.
right, if it was I don't think that. I'm not saying it's true. Let me be very clear about this. But there's a part of us in our Jewish psychosis, neurosis, chorosis, that worries that some of these moments are going to be our Kristama. Whether we think it's true or not, people younger than me I have been in a room where people younger than I have asked, where would you go? And if you haven't been in that conversation yet, buckle your seatbelts. Not because I think it's happening, but because it's part of our chlorosis.
So is Herzl identifying more as a Jew at this point?
I mean, it depends on what you mean. He's identifying as a part of the Jewish nation, the Jewish people.
Okay.
Because Dreyfus was an assimilated Jew. Dreyfus wasn't eating, like, you know, didn't eat kosher, to my knowledge. Right?
Would they be what today are called secular Jews?
Yeah, Herzl definitely was a secular Jew. I don't know. I didn't check Dreyfus's CC, so I don't know. So, you know, but yes, right. These are people who had made it in their sovereign country, whatever it was, right?
They're identifying as a part of the nation.
Yes, it's all. Look at us.
That's right.
You don't
It was in
look
1800.
Jewish. I mean, depends on what that means.
Except for me.
Right. Okay. So anyway, so we're gonna get through this, okay? So this is Herzl's plan. He says, let's steer into the skid. Let's go farther and say that Jewish power is not just becoming Joseph the number 2 or the court Jew in medieval Spain or Maimonides in the Turkish, you know, for the Sultan, the number 2 guy. Jewish power is going to be about creating a place where no one above us can kick us out or marginalize us.
What
or,
year is this?
1896. Okay? Okay. Yeah, by the way, that's a misnomer too. Everyone thinks that all this stuff was invented in 1948. It was not.
No,
It was not.
and it's
Okay.
meant many, many times.
So, all right, so Herzl says this, and then he says the following. He says something incredibly Jewish. He says, I'm not saying this to y'all. I'm saying this to a future generation. Because, and he literally says, in Basel, where the first Congress was, I created the Jewish state. It may take 5 years, it may take 50 years. People may think I'm crazy, they may laugh, they may deride my ideas, but trust me, in 5 years, maybe in 50 years, there will be a Jewish state. By the way, he said that in 1898, 1948, boom,
Yeah,
right?
he did say
Okay,
50
so
years.
do the
He
math,
did say
right?
50
Okay,
years.
he said 50 years. So, so he says those who inaugurate this movement are unlikely to see its glorious culmination. And then he says, he basically calls anyone who can't see it as stupid. If this generation is too dull to understand it rightly, a future finer, more advanced generation will arise to comprehend it. Now remember, he had no concept that there was going to be a Holocaust to sort of catalyze this and accelerate it, right? But it was already there. It was already on paper. He says, I consider the Jewish question, that's anti-Semitism, neither a social nor a religious one, though it sometimes takes these in other forms. Remember, we talked about the religion, we talked about Augustine, we talked about Dimi and stuff like that, right? It's a national question. That's the type of Jew he was, right? He was a Federation Jew, right? Who went to shul very infrequently. He never went to shul, right? But if something happened, you all know these Jews. By the way, many of us are these Jews. I'm at least a part one of these Jews too. Something happens to the Jewish people, I'm very Jewish.
Yeah, we see it here all the time.
I can tell you how I know this, because on Monday night, there were 1,100 people in that room, right? And then Rabbi Witkovsky said one thing. He said, Mariv, and then there were 400, right? Okay, I mean, a second later, right? Those 700 Jews are the Jews that are like Herzl, or maybe a little bit more Jewish, but not a lot of it more Jewish. Well, that's because you were tired. Okay, so, okay. It's because you had already
I was
done.
gonna say, be careful.
No, I'm not criticizing that.
Right,
That's,
right.
Herzl was, I mean, Herzl ranks up there. He's like on the Mount Rushmore. Come on, let's be honest,
Well, we
right?
see that here. Well, you know, I'll be surprised Saturday if we don't get a bigger crowd
Yeah, people are
than
gonna show up,
normal,
right,
because
right.
they told us on Monday to show
And by the
up.
way, I'm not saying that one doesn't cause the other,
Yeah.
right? There are people, not that I take attendance, but there are people who have been here almost every Shabbos since October 7th,
Yeah.
and now have found meaning in their Shabbos attendance,
That's right.
but wouldn't, and you know, I'm not gonna name their names because it's not nice. Okay, anyway, so, okay, I don't take attendance. Okay, so, all right, ready? So, we are a people, one people, Amachat, right? We have sincerely tried everywhere to emerge with national communities in which we live. These are critical lines, right? This is why it's all bold after this. I couldn't help myself, right? In vain, we are loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. Remember, he was writing in part in German. That's uber loyal, right? Okay. But think about what he's saying. He's saying super loyal doesn't just mean I'm a good American. Super loyal, to me at least, means I am willing to prioritize my Americanism over my Judaism. That's what super loyal means. He's saying it. By the way, he's describing himself. He was definitely more Viennese. Right? Okay. Oh, sorry, move the screen. Okay.
Thank you for paying attention.
There we go. Thank you. You're very observant, Joe. Okay, so in our native lands where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors did not yet come at a time when Jewish sites, that should be sites, had long been heard in the country. So no, that is Jewish sites. Jewish sites had long been heard in the country, right? The idea here is, like, yes, we predate them, but they're in charge. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. Wherever, that's the Shevet Israel thing. Whenever we remain politically secure for any length of time, we assimilate. And this is not praiseworthy. By the way, he's talking about himself. And then he talks about what was then called Palestine, our unforgettable historic homeland. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. Okay? We shall live at last as free men on our own soil. By the way, let me translate free men on our own soil into Hebrew. Liot am chofshi be'artzenu. Hatikva is quoting Herzl, essentially. Okay? The world will be liberated, and then he talks about and we will be part of the world community. Whatever we attempt to, for our own benefit, will redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind. Folks, we have to end, but here's what I'm going to say to you. We have not figured out how to have power. The world, for sure, has not figured out how to have power. If we can solve this one, we will solve Israel. We will not solve, but we will solve the current incarnation of anti-Semitism. We will solve assimilation. We will solve Jewish Voices for Peace. We will solve a lot of things. I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but I would argue that this is the critical Jewish question of identity in a moment when Israel stands threatened. Is how powerful are we going to be? I'll just end with two last quotes.
Well, and the answer to that we're powerful as long as Israel exists.
Israel has given a voice to that power, there's no question, right? There's the men who, and they were all men, the men who led in 1930s and 40s and said, don't go to Roosevelt, he's a busy man right now. We don't want him to bomb the tracks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those were very powerful men who were very conscious of how tenuous their Americanism was and how much they had to prove and how unsure they were as Jews walking into a White House. The only thing that changed between 1943, when that conversation happened, and 1948 was something that changed Jewish history. Israel gave, like the idea that we would have ministers and imams speaking at a rally against anti-Semitism would never have happened 89 years ago. It just wouldn't have happened. So the last two quotes are one from Elie Wiesel. He argues that never again has become one of our liturgical statements, right? Remember, Meir Kahane popularized it. Elie Wiesel and Meir Kahane did not see eye to eye. That's like the understatement of this whole session. And then I quote this all the time. You'll hear me quote it again because it destroyed me when I read it for the first time. There's a modern, he's younger than I am, there's a modern short story writer, Nathan Englander, who wrote a collection of short stories, which you definitely should read if you want to be really annoyed, called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. But one of the stories is called How We Avenged the Blums. How We Avenged the Blums. And the story is, I'm going to end with this, and then I'll stay on if people have questions or comments. Tom, this is the story that you tell of your upbringing. A kid who got Jacob Blum gets beat up by the bully, who does never named in the story, he's named the anti-Semite.
Surprised you remember that. You got a good memory.
And so Jacob Blum gets beaten up on the way home from school. This bully lies in wait, and so a bunch of these Jewish nerdy kids decide to do the thing that Jews are not allowed to do. They cut the last period of class. But first, they don't do it right away. They get trained by some washed-up Israeli soldier who teaches them Krav Maga, which they really can't do. And they cut class the last period. They lie in wait for the anti-Semite. They try to beat him up, and they don't do such a good job of it, but then their teacher comes in and takes care of the thing, and he says the following, and this, I think, is so much a part of Jewish identity right now, and how what we have to figure out is what it means to be Jewishly powerful. As I watched the Antietam flood them writhing out before us, I knew I'd always feel that to be broken was better than to break. To be broken was better than to break. That was my failing. Do you want to be the one who punches? Be the one who gets punched. Because sometimes the world is that clear. Unfortunately, sometimes
you
the world.
want to be the one who got punched, and then you punch back.
Well, that's
Right.
So,
and you punch back harder, right?
oh, much harder.
So that's the question that we are asking ourselves now in Gaza.
Right.
It's not equal, right? And Stan, we talked about this a little bit, and you really challenged. So I'll say, look, I will tell you, this year at my Seder, I think you can hold two things. I think you can hold both that what Israel is doing to assure its strength in punching back is justified, and you can have in the back of your head or in your hearts, as you take out that little bit of wine, that there is suffering that is concomitant to that is collateral to that. And that does not mean to apologize for the necessary desire to punch back and need to punch back. And it comes from a teaching in the Talmud where we get across the Red Sea and we're finally liberated. And then an obvious cathartic thing to do is to dance and sing. And the angels on high are dancing and singing. We are finally a free people. We're not yet in our land. And God stops the singing and says,
My children.
those are my creations too down there that are drowning in the sea. There are Palestinian people who are drowning. Not by-
Eric, just speak up a little bit so we can hear that. Go ahead.
There are Palestinian people who are drowning, not by our choosing or starving, though even that is questionable right now. But there are Palestinian people who are suffering, not by our choosing. We should not be triumphalist about that. We should be very sober in that. But when the world presents us the choice between to be broken or to break back, I am not willing to barely make it out alive like Elisha Amdat asks us to. And I'm not willing to celebrate that anymore. I'm just not there in being proud about that. I'm struggling with that.
We have been changed.
Yes. And we will see where that takes us. And by the way, you're going to hear some of this on the high holidays probably. But this, I think, is the critical Jewish question right now, is how we can exercise our power and not be like the Maccabees. I'll stick around for questions. I'm sorry I talked a
Eric,
little
why
bit.
don't we see if there are any questions here downtown or comments?
Hey, Eric, I do have a question. This is Jeremy Rosenbluth.
Hey, John.
The statistics you gave at the beginning of this talk about the ratio of military to civilian deaths, what was the denominator that you used? Was it the Hamas Health Ministry statistics for the number of total deaths or some other source?
So most of those things were coming from pro-Palestinian sources. So you can assume, obviously, the bias, right? Some of it came from the Hamas Health Ministry. Some of it came from UNRWA before UNRWA was essentially complicit in this whole thing, or was, but was revealed to be. But those are the type of, and some are coming from, aid, like humanitarian sources. They have varying levels of reliability, but none of them lean pro-Israeli.
No, but I think I think that the statistics are probably much better in terms of ratios than you presented, because
Correct.
the
Correct.
Hamas
But there are
statistics are
also,
false and should not be accepted at face value.
correct. But this is the best stuff that we have. And my point is, even what we say in Hebrew is alachat kama v'chama. If this is what the Palestinians are saying,
I get that.
Probably better than that, but I agree with you, but even so, it is almost unprecedented in modern warfare how careful Israel and humane Israel is being given the reality of war, and it could only be better than that. Let's put it that way. Not to mention the fact that most of the people, I mean, you hear this out on the Israeli side, anyone who has been in Gaza, they're all saying the same thing, which is that even the people that are being counted as civilians are harboring hostages, terrorists, and weaponry under their beds. There are Kalashnikov rifles under every child's bed. Children's beds. Yeah. So I agree with you that it is almost certainly even more humane than that, and I should have said that. But regardless, even what I gave you is unprecedented in modern warfare, and certainly should not be used as a critique, but if anything, should be held up as a model.
Eric, we have another comment here. Go ahead.
Here, it's Joy. I went on the mission with out of Israel. Can you repeat to us here the ratios that the Brigadier General said?
Yeah, those are the
Yeah.
ratios. He was quoting. The Brigadier General are the ones that was quote. So an Israeli Brigadier General gave us those numbers. I'll repeat them in a second. But they come from pro-Palestinian reports because Israel doesn't really have anything else to go on. The civilian to militant ratio, according to basically UNRWA, is 50-1, which means that indiscriminate bombing or carpet bombing or any of those terms would expect 50 civilians dead for every one Hamas militant killed. The reported, at the time of the Brigadier General, it was 1.8-1, which means that Israel was more than 25 times more cautious than indiscriminate bombing would say. It has now gone down since then to 1.6-1.
Meaning for every Hamas, for every Israeli,
Right,
the
basically
civilians.
1.6 civilians for every one Hamas, and that, of course, we have to remember that the Hamas are using human shields, and we have to remember that the Hamas are inflating their numbers, as Jeremy said, and we have to remember that Hamas is committing war crimes, and we have to remember that all of the things, and that it's urban warfare, and we also have to remember that American wars of recent have had a approximately 1 to 4.5 ratio.
So a lot of Hamas rockets backfire.
Right, so there's a lot of death, right, that is put on the laps of the Israelis. Something like, there's an estimate that right now the rockets are getting less press than the urban warfare, right? But when it was mostly rockets, there was a statement that as many as 800 rockets had fallen in Gaza, originated and then fallen in Gaza. And the one horrible thing with the hospital, that was either a Hamas or Islamic Jihad rocket. And they found radio in Arabic saying, "Oh, that was one of ours." Right. So they know it. But don't let the truth get in the way of the story that you want to tell.
And has there been any non-Jewish press coverage that you know of the 1-to-2 ratio?
I don't know that.
I'll comment on that. There's an article, Bob Friedel here, in Newsweek, March 25, by John Spencer, a name you mentioned, one of these Modern War Institute experts. Israel has created a new standard for urban warfare.
Yeah.
Why will no one admit it? Now take a look at Newsweek, March 25, John Spencer. You'll get more information on what you're talking about.
There was another guy out of the Carlisle War College who said something similar, the Carlisle, Pennsylvania War College. Not that guy, but it's there. You have to kind of dig pretty deep. You kind of spelunk through the, I just wanted to use that word. It's Jewish. Spelunking, right? It sounds like a Yiddish word,
Yeah,
right?
it's a shit.
It's like all those Yiddish words, like far-fetched,
It's spookish.
far-fetched, far-flung, these are all Yiddish words, right?
We use that.
Anyway, I'm happy to stay on, but I know that we've gone over time, and I'm sorry that I took, it's hard in this hybrid model to see where people are speaking, and obviously we had to go through a lot today. I want you to feel uncomfortable about this. If you're doing this right, you're gonna feel uncomfortable. Because I certainly do. And I think the most moral stance, while not abdicating Israel's right to defend herself and to be a source of strength for the Jewish world, the most moral stance on this is to be highly, highly troubled. That doesn't mean to say it's wrong, but to be highly, highly upset.
How do you respond to that public?
The question was, how do I respond to that publicly? Meaning, it's very hard, right? That's why we're having this conversation in a lunch and learn and not online, meaning like on social media or something like that. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really struggling with the high holidays, where it is a sort of mass-produced message, where you have 1,400 people hearing the message all at once and everyone hearing it slightly differently. Because it shouldn't be, but it is considered nuanced to say that the Palestinian people are suffering and that Israel is justified in its actions. We should be able to say both of those things. But my experience in a social media mediated world, and the fact that our brains have shifted, that even when it's not on social media, even when it's in person, and we're having this conversation, we're shifted to hear the soundbite only. My experience and my fear of saying it on the high holidays is that people are only going to hear one half of those two things, and whether they'll either hear, meaning the two things being the Palestinian people are suffering and Israel is justified, if they want to be enraged, they will hear me saying only the one that they disagree with. And if they want to be validated, they will hear only the one that they agree with and not the other one, right? And that's more about you than it is about me, which one you want to be. If you want to be enraged, I'll give you plenty. If you want to be validated, I'll give you plenty. But if you want to be really thoughtful and really troubled, you got to take both.
This is David Farman. Assuming you take both, and I do.
Right.
The trouble that I have is not the war itself, but what is the end game? That, to me, is more troubling, and I have difficulty explaining that, particularly to non-Jews.
I agree with you on that. I would say the following. This is not an Entebbe, right? This is not, we're going to make movies out of this. And by the way, Entebbe wasn't Entebbe. Yoni Netanyahu died. We all it's like the Anne Frank thing that Darwin said. We forget that there was death there, right? Not to mention the old lady who had been taken to the hospital that Idi Amin went and just shot her in the head, right? Okay? But this is not ever going to be an Entebbe. Ever, ever, ever. And so it's not going to be clean. And so then success looks like whatever is better than option B. Right? If option B, meaning the intolerable one, is leaving Hamas standing and believing that they are going to plan another October 7th, then option A has to be to debilitate Hamas to the best of our abilities. Until we can't, and if we can't for whatever reason, then we have to deal with that in the same way the United States had to deal with Afghanistan and Vietnam. Right? But we're not there. In fact, here's something you don't hear a lot about. Israel is winning the war. Hamas is 85+% debilitated, with the exception of one town. And by the way, any other country in the world would be attacking that town in a hot second. We're talking about Rafah. right? The fact that we're waiting till the end of Ramadan already is like, I mean, it's militarily insane and morally validating.
But that doesn't make the press.
No, come on, it doesn't make the press at all. But Israel's in a bind because all they're going to choose is the thing that is better than the next worst thing. But it's not going to be good. And by the way, it's not going to be decisive either, right? You know, like we know that, right? It's not. We're not killing extremism, right? But that's not a reason to accept defeat either, or surrender. By the way, you know that surrender is also bad for everywhere else in the world. Don't forget that in the year after 9/11, there was a London subway bombing and a Paris subway bombing and plenty of other things as well. It emboldens other terror. It's gonna happen. So unless we prove that this is a bad way to get your aims, no matter what your aims are, it's gonna be bad. Not that that makes me happy. None of it makes me happy. None of it makes me happy.
And we have an Olympics coming up this summer.
You gotta hold your breath.
Right.
Anyway.
How do you respond to the two-state solution?
Oh my God, that's another session.
No, I mean, I don't know how to respond, so I'm asking you.
Right now,
One more day to answer that.
so I'm going to give you the very, very quick example, and then we'll talk about it another time. There is a teaching by Maimonides that says, I believe in the coming of the Messiah, but if the Messiah doesn't come, I'm still going to wait. There are solutions, long-term solutions for existence in the same plot of land. The two-state solution is one, and an important one. We are nowhere near it. And I think it is irresponsible to plop it down and say, this is going to be the conclusion of this war. And anyone who says that, it just doesn't know the reality on the ground. The United States, by the way, is not saying that. The United States is saying a path toward, which is very vague terminology because there are some very long paths out there, right? But neither side is ready to even have that conversation. And if it would, you want to worry about colonialism? The worst colonialist move that could be made in the current world reality would be to impose an artificial two-state solution on two states, neither of which want it right now. It's not, we're not ready for it. It breaks my heart. And you have to remember, in the 90s, I was like all for it. It breaks my heart, but we're not there. But I'm not giving up hope, just like Maimonides. Well, I guess Maimonides died, so I guess he gave up hope. But others, picked up the mantle. Yeah, right. Yeah. But anyway, we got to give up. We can't give up hope, and we can't rush it in a way that is irresponsible, and then more people will die.
Thank you.
Wish I had hope for you, folks.
Well, thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
Great.
I think we've had a very interesting discussion and we'll certainly continue it each month. For those who are lawyers, leave your CLE forms with us. And for everyone, let's hope for some better days ahead. Eric, thank you for leading us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Be well. Bye. Doug is.
Go ahead.
You dismissed?